to Steve Matthews. Steve is one of our faculty in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. He does wildlife and trees, and I always tell Marnie, you know, your wildlife need my trees. So it makes sense that it all goes together. But there's this cool tool that I've been using when I talk to different groups, depending on the group, on this climate change tree atlas. And it's a great resource for folks. But I know enough to be dangerous when I talk about it. Hopefully Steve can eliminate the danger and present it as an overview for all of the questions that you may have. Because I will say, and Steve and I have talked about this, the questions I get most are, if I'm planting trees, what should I plant for the future? How do I figure climate change into what I'm going to plant? And so this is part of that tool that you can take a look at and make some educated decisions. So with that, Steve, let me get out of here.
Right.
And it's all up to you.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to be talking today, and appreciate the opportunity to kind of share, the latest kind of on our effort with the climate change tree and bird atlas. And yeah, so hopefully, that question about what to plant, and I think the one thing that we always, like to say is it really comes down to that, local knowledge and kind of understanding of what's happening. My screen just went blank. Well, apologize. What's going on?
You're okay.
Sure.
Yeah, we can still see you.
But my screen sharing went away. That's weird.
Oh yeah.
That is weird. Hopefully maybe there's too many people joining from Cotman home.
Overload the system.
What are we doing here? Is it still, is it working now?
Yep.
Okay,
yep, we can
cool.
see.
Sorry about that. I better get going before it totally wonks out. So yeah, just to begin with, so talking about the climate change tree atlas today, primarily, and hopefully you can see the many different ways that it can be used to answer questions regarding forests and climate change, but also just understanding and appreciating the diversity of forests we have across the eastern U.S. and the important ways in which those environmental conditions play an important role. And so I will just start off by saying really this work is something we've been working on almost has been the last 20 years. I feel fortunate to be involved with. Louis Iverson is now retired from the Forest Service, from the research station. Nathan Prasad, kind of kicked this off in the late 90s, and then myself and Matt Peters joining early 2000s, and Andy Gowry's a new research scientist at the lab there. So it's really kind of a collective effort, and I'm just kind of representing our group to talk about the atlas. I'm not going to necessarily go into lots of backgrounds when we think about climate change here today, because I want to spend most of the time just kind of walking through what the climate change atlas is and how it can be used and gain information. But it's important that we have this context that climate is certainly changing, and forests are responding in many different ways. We're thinking about changes in distribution, changes in disturbance regimes, right? These are all affecting the trajectory and shape that forests have. And so as these magnitudes of change continue to accelerate, we need these tools and develop strategies to think about how we can maintain healthy and productive forests. So these are really kind of the motivators that have been driving us for the last number of years. And the Atlas tool is really this technological transfer tool that we've developed and have tried to add, with comments from users, with comments from managers and the public about what kind of information do people need regarding potential impacts and responses of forests to climate change. So that's kind of where we fit in. And then ultimately, like with these big challenges and these important topics, right, it really comes down to collaboration and partnerships to really, steward our forests now and to keep them healthy into the future. So just really acknowledging the great work that has come through collaborations and getting the word out, and really come up with really unique ways to use the climate change tree atlas. When we started, it was really just, can we put this data up there, as an aspect. We didn't necessarily think about the important technological transfer aspects that are there. So that's kind of what I want to talk about a bit today. So that's kind of the context of kind of where we're going. and really just to stress the important aspect of collaboration in there. And so just to begin with, and I thought it would be helpful just to give you a sense of kind of where we're coming from. So we often refer to our group as Landscape Change Research Group, and we're really trying to understand species distributions and those climate impacts on distributions, and that's kind of the fundamental questions we want to answer and ask. And the Atlas is really that tool that hopefully allows that science to be accessible to a really broad user base. And we have seen these evolution and change over time with the atlases, but basically along the lines of as our kind of research has developed. It started with the hard copy book, right? With Lewis and Prasad developing 80 tree species. And this was really kind of new at the time of trying to understand current and for future habitats for individual tree species. Started with 80 tree species. And this is where we kind of begin to write about and we start to see the aspects of thinking about species vulnerability to climate change, that we could think about anticipating how those habitats would change through time, right? Then we begin to develop additional tools, right? And we kind of show up more on the web. And we understand that, developing models are great, but they're missing components to that. And so with the second version of the Atlas, we started to incorporate life history information to think about and write about the ways in which we can think about species adaptability outside of just the modeled habitats of where a species currently is and its future habitats, right? To add that additional piece of, is it really shade tolerant, right? How does it deal with floods? And that kind of provides an additional aspect when we think about risk potentially for species to respond to climate change. This is also with version 2 where we kind of integrate the bird atlas component, where we're using the tree information as well as climate change to think about changes in bird distributions and habitats with climate change. So adding another dimension to the ecosystem. The third atlas, really, we were getting lots of comments about, this is great information, but what does it mean for my area? There my computer goes again. I apologize. Oh my goodness. I don't know what's going on with my computer. Geez.
That's okay.
I don't know what's going on. It must be a connection, maybe. If this happens one more time,
You're back.
I'll switch it out. So yeah, let me get back on gear here. So yes, so with that, right, we wanted to think about these combined species outputs, think about local capabilities of species to cope with climate change and also provide those regional summaries. And then our most recent version, which I'll be talking about here today, really is not only thinking about where those habitats potentially would change, but now thinking about what is the colonization likelihood? What is the likelihood that a tree will be able to migrate over the next century? And this kind of gets us into implications of assisted migration. Kathy was asking about what trees to plant, and that's kind of the dimension we are. And then I would like to end up with kind of where we're going as well, just to say that these tools are constantly being developed and hopefully provide continued information that can be used. So just wanted to begin with just as these atlases developed over time, the one really great aspect to see is the real broad user base that we have seen with the atlas. Essentially around 250,000 users a year kind of stumble onto the atlas in one way. And I really will say, working with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences, the USDA climate hubs, have really been champions of this work and getting it out into the hands of the public and managers, developing vulnerability assessments, climate change response frameworks. And then we're trying to incorporate more ways in which users can get that information. And so what's really interesting to me, is just to see the many different ways people are using the atlas. Whether it's someone like myself in the classroom, for students, but even developing modules for elementary and middle school students, and really some of the greatest workshops we've had when we've had teachers learning about the climate change. That's some of the great questions there, The ways in which it's used in forest planning and considerations of management. These are just some of the national forests we work closely with in terms of thinking about what trees to plant, how can those forests be more resilient in the face of climate change, So these applications for land management, both at the federal and state level, as well as private and NGOs. And then moving into different spaces of such as urban forest, of thinking about tree planting initiatives, and how can we think about climate change and integrate that into our planning decisions. So this is just a kind of a smattering of different ways of use. And I think the reason why there's so many different ways of use is because there's so much information that can be garnered from the atlases. And so that's really what I want to spend the next bit about, is just try to talk a little bit about the more recent update for the climate change tree atlas. It was just a few years ago. We tried to update, the information based on our latest research, right? Because those are always changing, but also to try to create ways in which that data will be more accessible. So these tutorials, like if you go to the homepage, really provide kind of walkthroughs of way in which you can think about this climate change, think about those life history characteristics, think about choosing a regional aspect to explore what's happening potentially on climate change within your areas. So we think about the atlas, it really is made up of 3 core components. One is thinking about the habitats. So I'll talk a little about those. Current distributions and potential changes in distributions, 125 tree species, 147 birds that we kind of work heavily to do that. The next aspect, we'll talk about the life history characteristics and how those can be used. And then finally, going into a little bit about this colonization link. I will just give a shout out to Lewis Iverson. Before he retired, he sat down and basically wrote his summary essentially of all 125 species, of how someone who has been doing it forever, when he looks at these results collectively, how would he interpret those? So I think that's a really great place to start if you kind of do join into the tree atlas. But there's lots of other information private here. I'll talk a little bit about those. So the first part is the distribution of species currently in potential habitats into the future. And I just want to point out, right, we want to have an understanding they're relatively coarse, right? We're talking about 10 by 10 kilometer cells in places where there's less forest inventory analysis data, right? That's a 20 by 20 kilometer cell. So it's relatively coarse. That's an important thing to remember. But the forest inventory analysis data set is a really great resource where we can look at this across a broad suite of species. And then also we want to think about why a species occurs where they do, right? It's certainly climate is important. But we also, if we're thinking about trees, we know that soil conditions, soil properties, and characteristics are also important. So these are the environmental variables that kind of go into understanding basically why species occur where they do across the eastern US. And then we can develop our methods and models around that, right? To have a response variable, which is importance value or a metric of abundance we can think about. And then we can then project those onto these different climate change scenarios, right? So moderate emissions, higher emissions scenarios to project those habitat changes, to look at a range of responses. So that's kind of where we're going. So when you go to the atlas and you pick on sugar maple, right, you get a picture of its current distribution and how it's characterized by those environmental variables, right? Areas of high abundance, the low abundance. And for example, for sugar maple, right, climate variables are important, but the most important predictors have more to do with soil characteristics in many ways. And then climate comes in to also shape those distributions. So it's really this important combination of those. And then we can project those habitats under different scenarios and get a sense visually of how those habitats are projected to change. So some declines in the overall abundance, right? But not necessarily the spatial extent, right? In terms of those habitat quality. And we'll get into the kind of numeric aspects next, but that's kind of the visual way we can do. And you can shift through many of these different scenarios. So that's one aspect of the visual component, learning about its current distribution and then potential habitat. And as I mentioned earlier, right, it's not all just about where those kind of habitats are currently, species abundances, and how those are changed, right? We also, if we want to think about more complete how a species may respond to climate change, what are those individual life history characteristics that may make a species more or less likely to be able to adapt to future changes and pressures? So here we kind of bring in life history characteristics, right? Where we think about biological characteristics like shade tolerance, and how does it disperse, right? As opposed, in addition to how does it respond generally to disturbances, right? And we can think about these in terms of based on the literature. We can score them. We can think about how uncertain we are about those given factors, and then we can think about how relevant are those going to become into the future and get a sense for those important characteristics that may be positive traits for a species to respond to climate change. So even if it declines in habitat, maybe that species can overcome them in some ways. So just to give that's kind of too vague, right? We have these 20 some characteristics that we kind of spent a long time kind of exploring, right? We can take two species that kind of have very different fit different places on the scale of adaptability, red maple versus balsam fir, right? We can think about them in terms of this aspect of disturbance on the x-axis, right? Biological traits on the y-axis. We can think about the diagonal aspect of having positive biological traits and positive disturbance traits, species like red maple, relative to a species like balsam fir, right, which has limitations of disease, insects, as well as more specific environmental restrictions in terms of its ability to respond. So we would think about those as this relative scale across these 100, in this case 34 species, right? What is the relative ability for these species to likely adapt? And we can combine that with information of the habitats, right? So it gives us this other picture. And it's important too, right, to note that in certain areas, right, you can weight these characteristics by local knowledge as well. The third component of the atlas, right, which is relatively new in terms of the atlas, but we've been working on this topic for quite a while, is really to represent and understand that there's this temporal time mismatch between projecting a habitat for species like northern red oak currently and into the future with how those trees would actually be able to move, right, over the next century or so. So to do that, this is again Prasad leading the way in developing the tool, the shift aspect that allows us to quantify colonization likelihood by looking at what is the potential for a given tree species based on its dispersal ability through generations to actually fill in those areas that are projected to have a high habitat. So I'm not going to go through too much detail, but just to note that the darker the blues, right, there's a higher likelihood of either potential migration, so the northern edge of its range, or filling into areas where it currently does not occupy. And as we kind of get more to the grays and the yellows, right, these are areas where yes, habitat may be there, but there's very little chance for that species to potentially migrate to those areas, right? And so we start to see like places like northern Maine, yeah, the habitat's there, but it's going to be a challenge for the species to make it on its own, right? And so that's where you start to bring in that temporal dimension to hopefully provide another layer of information. And just to really quickly run through just a couple examples, not to belabor it, but just to give you a sense for the types of tools that are also available visually on the atlas, right? If we take eastern white pine, we can think of its current distribution, projected changes in the habitat, and then this map provides the difference, right, between those two. And we can see an area like we have regional vulnerability assessments, so like mid-Atlantic area, some areas of increases in habitat, some declining. Overall, if you were to sum it up, potential loss of about 20% of that habitat by the end of the century for eastern white pine. And then we can also think about what are those important traits that we want to consider, right? The positive traits, wind dispersal is certainly one, but other challenges, they've been respected in terms of its fire tolerance with projected increases in fire. Just another example, just to provide a contrast example, a species declining to a species potential increase in habitat would be sweet gum, right? Very abundant in the Southeast, right? Has some of these positive attributes, right? Positive components, right, that we think about in its response. We certainly know that it wouldn't be able to occupy into farther New England by the end of the century, but we can get a sense that certainly along the Appalachian front, even areas into southern Ohio, potential for that species to continue to migrate, right, over the next century. So an important way we can think about those tools. So that's a lot of information, right? You can think about doing that for 125 species, and I can see how that people's heads would be spinning about, okay, how do I actually use this? And that's where we have also tried to spend more time in thinking about how can we make these data more usable for managers and the public to understand the impacts of climate change. And to do that, right, is to think about how do we summarize this data down to given areas. This is an example, right? If we were to break the Eastern US into 1 by 1 degree grids, right, we can start to think about the number of species that have maybe poor capability to global climate change, right? We can see patterns of how that looks if you kind of stack all those tree species up. right? And then we can also conversely see where are those areas that species may be able to migrate over the next 100 years, right? So that's kind of the core aspect of starting to stack these together and see what we can learn. And so what we have done from there, right, is develop a bunch of ways, kind of already summarized information. And I'm just highlighting two of them here. One, right, of the ecosystem ecological vulnerability assessments that we've been a part of across the Northeast, right? The Central Appalachians kind of is the one that covers Ohio, at least in the Appalachian Foothills region. And then we move into West Virginia and in Maryland. Central, that would be the Central Appalachian Vulnerability Assessment. Or we can look at those 1 by 1 degree grids. Right here, I just zoomed in into, this is essentially Zaleski State Forest, Fenton Furnace, Experimental Forest, the Athens District of the Wayne National Forest, right? We can start to get summaries of species across these areas. For what I'm going to show next, right, is if we were to go to the Eastern US and just pick Ohio, right? Because that was the theme of today's topic. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like. And so one, right, it can be a lot of information to look at. So I'm kind of giving you that warning, but I'm going to kind of walk through and hopefully begin to link up the maps to the actual data that can be used to think about current distributions as well as changes in habitats for species. So the first page that you get to, if you were to download it, would be kind of a lot of information, right? But it synthesizes information first about the species that are present, right? So we can think about for Ohio, we essentially are looking at 113 species. 78 of those are currently kind of recorded on forest inventory analysis plots state that we're focused on. 37 of those, right? It's essentially are projected to decline by 20% in habitat, and 23 are projected to increase, right? It already gets at this interesting aspect of the potential changes in those dynamics of forest in terms of suitability of habitats. And then, essentially 13 species having new habitat, and of those 5 would likely be able to migrate at the end of the century. So we start a picture, it's a snapshot of those changes. We also feel like it's important to provide information about the climate change dimension that are going into influencing these changes in habitat, but also provide that literacy about climate change in any given location across the Eastern US. And so basically here, I'm just summarizing these figures over here for average temperature, right? Under the lower emissions, 4.5, and then the 8.5 models and these 3 different climate models that we're looking at, right? We're not just looking at one, but we have a variety of information on 3 different models, and then these 2 different components, right? And so essentially, right, this whether we're talking about a 12%, and this is in 2 time periods between 2070 and then 2099, in terms of potential changes in annual temperature, and then really stressing this aspect that we were thinking about the growing season from May to September, right? The potential increases in climate, right, correspond to changes in precipitation. In this case, by the end of the century, very much lower changes in precipitation relative to potential changes in climate. So that becomes an important part of just understanding how those patterns are coming into play. And these are also what's informing those tree species projections that we provide. And this table is essentially what you get for any area that you select, right? And it's a list of all the species. So this can look like a lot, but I just want to point out a few aspects and walk through a couple examples. Hopefully it'll provide a way in which you can think about potentially using this to informed about forest responses to climate change. First is, right, when we're talking about any sort of model, right, there's all these different abilities to actually capture a species distribution. So model reliability is important. We can do a pretty good job at capturing a species like red maple across this distribution, right? But it's a little harder for us to capture a species like black locust, given the nature of those conditions, right? That's the first important thing to understand. There's a level of uncertainty there. The next component is thinking about how currently abundant a species is, whether you're looking at the summed importance value from FIA or some average of that, right? These are kind of highlighted in these colors, and these are kind of automatically coded, right? The potential changes in habitat under these different scenarios is next, right? That's kind of what's reflected in those maps of larger decreases or smaller decreases or smaller increases or larger increases for each species. Adaptability is really capturing those life history characteristics. We saw that red maple is really high, likely adaptable to climate change, right? And we see that represented here. And then finally, if you can kind of combine how abundant a current species is, what's its potential change, what are its adaptability traits, right? You can get a sense for a capability for that species to cope with climate change. So even though red maple is projected to decline, right, because it's so abundant and has other traits, it likely will be an important species remaining on the landscape based on its habitat characteristics. This last column over here kind of provides that information about those species that may be less common or may be able to infill within the state of Ohio over the next 80 years, or right, thinking of those species that aren't really present, or if they are, they're very, very rare, they aren't picked up in forest inventory analysis, then they have potential to migrate over the next 100 years based on that colonization likelihood piece. So a lot of information here. And so just to provide an example for white oak, American beech, southern red oak, right? We kind of have different trajectories of those aspects. White oak being an important species does have the potential to have small increases given those characteristics, right? And be a very good capability to cope within Ohio, not so much if you're in other portions of its range. Whereas American beech, right, potential declines in habitat, along with its challenges, right, of disease and pathogens, right, has a poor capability to cope. Right? And so it's important when you think about these tables, right, to also think about the maps that go along with it, right? And so just visually getting a sense for the potential changes in white oak habitat, American beech habitat, right? You can certainly see the thinning in terms of habitat for American beech, whereas white oak essential expansion, but maybe at lower abundance, right? So it kind of gets at those values that we'd see a large of changes in small increases for white oak and declines for American beech and habitat. And then we can get southern red oak and this potential for colonization, especially within Southeast Ohio towards the end of the century. So these are all kind of our data-driven ways in which we can start to piece these kind of components together. It says that's a lot of information. I just want to kind of give a couple examples of application to maybe hopefully give a couple of ways in which maybe you can see these data being used or being informative. The first place to look, I mean, has certainly been, through our collaborations, as I mentioned before, with Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences and USDA Northern Forest Climate Hubs. There's a lot of really great resources where many folks got together, including managers and scientists, to develop these vulnerability assessments that really are comprehensive, right? The central hardwoods, central Appalachians, right? And so on and so forth, provide a lot of really great information. Some folks on the call today were involved in those, which is a really great way, right? Using this information to think about assisted migration, ranking species, and then making those decisions based on local needs and understanding of the system is important. And the Atlas provides a baseline step for that. And then essentially, as we think about importance, role it can play within forest planning, as we think about long-term trajectories in terms of changing forests. The next aspect, the next example I wanted to give is also just to really acknowledge that what we think about and how the data can be used, right? It's often enhanced by when people reach out and ask and show an interest in those. So these are just two recent examples. One would be kind of the development, right, of the new agroforestry handbook the Forest Service is developing, going through all species kind of utilized in different agroforestry settings, whether it's, ranging from windbreaks to riparian to silvopasture. We actually have 49 species present within the Atlas that we can then begin to think about the potential responses of those trees with climate change and embed those into that real rich understanding of important life history characteristics that are used in thinking about trees that are beneficial for agroforestry. This is just a table, right, for Southeast Ohio in terms of projected changes, but we have a range of species that have very different kind of utilizations in agroforestry. So this is part of that agroforestry handbook that's coming out, right, where we provide a small piece thinking about climate change in the context of that. And then also within urban forests, right? Just like in agroforestry, we have very different management style than our traditional kind of forest, right? We're thinking about silviculture and those aspects. different ways in which you approach it, different management and control at the individual level where you can enhance these species, but they also have different challenges. So whether we're thinking about the City of Columbus Urban Forest Master Plan that was really great led, but kind of a way in which Atlas information can be used to think about that. New York City Parks also did a similar assessment using the Atlas to think about those trees that may be planted in those urban settings, and using additional information supplemented with some of that information from the Atlas. And the third aspect is really kind of thinking about the next steps in science that we have to understand, right? And the adaptive silviculture for climate change is a really great nationwide kind of study that's looking at implementing, silviculture with climate change in mind. And the Atlas certainly is an important part in thinking about those species that may be able to be planted now and then monitor with other silviculture treatments to ensure that they can to evaluate what are the ability for those trees to grow now that may have their suitable habitat not for 50 to 60 years down the road. So this is the Ohio Hills one, right? I just wanted to highlight it because it's being led by Bryce Adams. He's a former student, PhD student here, current research silviculturist at the Delaware lab. But you can see the broad ranges of partners, both the Forest Service and the Division of Forestry, coming together, right, to kind of develop this Ohio Hills Ask project. And really this idea of, thinking about the important ways that we can maintain oak management within the region, being collaborative, thinking about the unique settings that provide these rich and diverse forest habitats, and then thinking about the implications that we have with climate change. And what does that mean in terms of how we can adapt our silviculture to ensure that they're healthy and productive? So I'm not going to go too far into it, but just to state, right, if you're not familiar with it, right, this idea of resistance and maintaining relative conditions and change, so maintain those oak dominant stands. So we can think about the types of silviculture we kind of currently have ongoing with some modifications to resist those climate change components. Resilience treatments, right, which is really kind of thinking about the current conditions, but encouraging and evaluating ways in which we can return to those reference conditions. In this case, using different kind of expanding gap kind of harvests to provide light, so we can have natural regeneration of the species that are present there, maybe that are more rare, but are likely to do better into the future. And then the third component would be the transition, which is where we use the tree atlas information to identify not only tree species that would likely have suitable habitat within Southeast Ohio, but also through work of Bryce and others of thinking about where would you source those seeds in order for them to be able to grow well here in the future. So identifying tree species as well as nurseries within Missouri, right, to provide those seedlings to grow them up, and then the plan is for harvesting to occur this year. It's an example of the transition treatment, right, where kind of mid-story removal, gaps and reserves, and then planting within those gaps. So the atlas is an important tool in terms of thinking about those tree species and where to get them from, and to test these questions of, can we adapt the silviculture to ensure that our forests can be maintained healthy and productive. And then just to say like where we're heading, and hopefully some of these other ways will provide, other insights and important uses and advance our knowledge and understanding of climate change impacts from forest. One is, we've been constrained to the Eastern US for a long time, but through collaborations with our colleagues and Canadian Forest Service and Mexico colleagues in terms of inventories across Mexico, we are now able to look at tree species across their full ranges, which is really a great aspect. And Prasad and Matt being kind of in very involved with the new Silvics of North America project and being in the core mapping team, we kind of are able to then think about these questions, not only just within the Eastern US, but across the continent. And in doing so, right, it allows us to reevaluate the way in which we're thinking about this life history characteristics. So Molly McDermott, who's currently a research associate here, is really leading the way in updating these scores, both in terms of new pest information, new shade information, but also increasing the number of species that we can really have more quantitative traits to think about species adaptability to changes. So that's going to really advance our ability to think about it. And then to really provide this user kind of ability to adjust these life history characteristics, based on local information. White oak doesn't behave the same in Virginia as it does in Southern Michigan, right? So thinking about those life history characteristics regionally is an important part of that. Another important aspect, right, now that we have a kind of a continental perspective, we can start to ask questions and are currently asking questions, and Andy Gowrie is leading, right? We have 300 or so tree species. We can start to think about what are the tree communities across the continent, and what are the potential for these novel and disappearing tree community assemblages, right? And so that sounds like, what the heck is he talking about here in this aspect? But it really provides us a tool to think about what are the current tree species community across the continent, and trying to identify where those locations of those communities. So a Jacquard index is, as it goes up towards 1, those tree communities become more and more unique, right? Towards the, if we think about projected future into the habitats at the end of the century, as those numbers are smaller, right? Those communities are much more similar. They have an analog, right? Nearby, or they have an analog kind of within this context. And so you begin to appreciate and understanding by taking this perspective, like places like the Southeast have these really potential disappearing forest communities, right? If we think about at the assemblage level, not at the species level, but at the full community component, as well as in portions of central Canada, right? And here within central Ohio, we have relatively more closer analogs to the communities, but it's an important aspect that it starts to give us this understanding of how these communities potentially will shift and respond and find their analogs going forward. So for the eastern temperate forest, right, that flow of those types of forest communities shifting more to places where we have our northern forest. If you think about this ecoregion, northern forests, potential transition to more of a taiga components, and those taiga components transitioning more towards those tundra species more from the taiga. So we can kind of begin to track and think about and identify areas for assisted migration, areas where we want to represent our current extant communities, how far we have to go in order to find places where those communities would likely be able to be maintained into the future. So it's a more of a community perspective, which is really important when we think about important forest communities that we have. And the last aspect that I think is really relevant and will really begin to enhance the Atlas products is really not only thinking about current conditions and potential changes in habitat, but what are those important disturbance agents that are acting on the landscape at present, and how will they shape those trajectories of our forest change? So if we overlay kind of contemporary changes of a contemporary ongoing climate, ongoing pest and pathogen biotic interactions, ongoing human pressures, right, we begin to see an emerging pattern of these clusters of areas where we have combinations of these disturbances affecting forests. And this effort is allowing us to think regionally in terms of hotspots of where these changes, these interactions are already underway, and that provides an important aspect to think about how those habitats would be changing to the future, right? So in the eastern forest, eastern U.S., right, large human influence levels, high pest levels, right, which is in contrast to out west, where we have really large measurable climatic shifts, right? In some cases, sporadic impacts of pests. And this kind of gives us that picture and that nuance to think about areas where management, areas where attention needs to be given if we're going to realize those potential changes in habitats towards the end of the century. So fitting that into the timeline of trajectories of change with climate change for forests. The last example I'm going to give is just to say that we're not also just interested in where trees are going. Getting back to Kathy's introduction, right? We also can utilize information about changes in climate for bird distributions. In addition, if we want to have this more complete understanding of forest vulnerability, thinking about wildlife components within there. So if we think about the Central Appalachian vulnerability assessment that was done for trees a number of years ago, right? We have a list of tree species that are potential to be considered for may decrease, may increase, right? Very much focused on that tree community. But we also have our climate change bird atlas, where we're beginning to integrate those into vulnerability assessments, right? Fortunately for Ohio, right, we have the great resource of managing forest birds. We have the new all bird conservation plan, and we actually have 26 of the 32 focal priority bird species present within our bird atlas components, right? And we can then begin to understand, if we think about the Ohio kind of important focal bird species, right? We can then begin to use that in a very similar way that we do our tree species vulnerabilities, right? And we can get a sense for, of these species, more than half of those kind of priority bird species are projected to decline in habitat by the end of the century. When we think about both climate change and potential changes in tree species habitat conditions. And if we look across these kind of priority bird species, many of them show really strong, important links to those specific forest conditions, right? Whether we're thinking about a species, in terms of utilizing specific oak species like cerulean warblers, right? Whether we're thinking about towhees, right? In terms of regenerating tulip poplar kind of areas, kind of thick aspects. So these all come up in these distribution models, and they kind of give us this link to think about another dimension of vulnerability within our forest, and this idea that maintaining healthy forests is important not only for forest dimensions, but also wildlife and human use as well. And so with that, I'm going to kind of wrap it up here, so we have plenty of time for questions. But just to say, that climate change is altering species distribution and dynamics within forests. It's already responding in terms of trees and bird species and many other taxa to climate change. We hope that these models can be helpful, right, in terms of anticipating those changes and really allowing public and managers to really be engaged in devising these kind of management strategies that will allow us to maintain healthy, productive forests, right? So we're not making management projections, but providing a toolbox, hopefully that people can use that knowledge to then apply within their situation. So with that, I'll be happy to take some questions if there's time.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks,
And
Steve.
as you went along, I was kind of putting some chats or some links in the chat box to some of the things that you shared. So folks, if you missed those, just scroll up, they're right there. Kathy, do you want me to do the Q&A or?
You can. I have a question for Steve first before I forget it. You were talking in there about updating the Silvix. So are we getting updated Silvix kind of manuals like we had before?
Yeah, it's going to look a little different. And that's kind of the big strategies that we've been talking about now, is like, as we're updating we're more involved in the mapping side of things.
Right.
But, as we kind of develop the next kind of round of information here, is like, how do those talk together, right? So they're more dynamic. And yeah, so author teams are working on those. And I believe Prasad and Matt have sent the map packages for all these 300 species to all those author teams to like use that as that. So yeah, and then they're updating with more Silvix information. It really feeds well back within our kind of life history aspects
Sure.
As well. And so we've been trying to talk about how those two will ensure that they talk together, and so they can be more updatable and dynamic. But yeah, they need to be updated. So it's exciting.
Yeah, we're revising and updating Ohio Trees, our publication, and we use the both hardwood and conifer Silvix books for all that info that was originally put in there by Chadwick when they made the first Ohio Trees. So we've been using those online references, and I mean, it's going to take us a while, but I'm wondering if we should consider trying to incorporate updated info instead of relying totally on the older publications. But you and I can talk about that. I wanted to verify that that's what you meant when you said that.
Yeah.
Because I see changes that probably need to go into the new book.
Yeah. So I'm really glad that they're doing that. So Steve McNulty and others kind of leading the way in doing that. So yeah.
Good to know. Thanks.
Okay. We have our first question, and it is, will the headings for the columns of tables in the slides have a key to explain what they are when we look at the site?
Great. Yes, they do. And I'm almost tempted just to go there. I don't know if you want me to go there. I can go there. But if you were to I mean, maybe I will.
Yeah, feel free to.
Should I dare do that? I will
Yes,
dare.
play
I will dare do
dangerous.
that.
Come on, it's Friday.
You can do it.
It's Friday. Yeah, all right. So I will show you because I think it's also better to just show you and then
Yeah.
to wave my hand and talk about something. So you want to go somewhere in particular? We'll go to National Forest because it's easy, right? And we'll go to Allegheny. But if you can either do an Excel file if you want to like do stuff with the data, or you can do a PDF file. PDF does not have the definitions, but if you go to the Excel file for it, it's something that I'm still sharing the right screen, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, let me bring it over. So if you were to go to that file, I know it looks like a lot, right? This is essentially what I was showing, definitions. This is essentially showing, I was just showing a screenshot from those. But there's the next tab over is the definitions for all those aspects.
Okay.
And they really try to provide exactly like where decisions and cutoffs are made, but really also just to provide components to there. And if you really want to get into it, right? I mean, we have the aspects of interpreting the table, right? So another handy tool to think about what each of those columns mean. And then if you're really, really love it, right? And you want the actual numbers behind all those values, they're in the long version, right? And so that's kind of where I was getting the number of species changing by 20%, right? That's essentially, I did all that stuff from the table. I didn't do anything else fancy, right? So all of that is very easily accessible.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that helps
is awesome.
to see where you pulled that information from. Awesome. Cool. All right. Next question. If you had to plant only a few trees, which are the best choices for Dublin, Ohio? Or how would you determine that maybe? And she's
Steve, I
asking,
told you.
like,
These
oh,
questions I get.
sycamore.
Let me go,
That's
let me
what
go
people
back
wanna
to
know.
that. That's a great question. So my answer in some ways is going to be, it really depends on your objectives, right? I mean, it really does. And as planting trees, you have control over, water and all those aspects. And I think that, can't be stressed enough, right? I will say you could, if you wanted for, Dublin, I mean, probably a good place to start, and I think it really is just to start, right, is to think about something like the urban information for Columbus, right? Because it includes not just Columbus, but it has to have a buffer around that. And we essentially, thinking about just as I did, kind of going through species that are present, right? And how abundant they are, what's the potential changes in the habitat, what is life history characteristics, right? And thinking about how those come into play, right? And that's really the guidance that I would say. We do have a user manual that I should be out pretty soon, and in that we go through an example about how someone would decide potentially what to plant, but it really is contingent on those. And this other paper that I kind of mentioned briefly, and it's, oh, sorry, my mouth is going haywire, apologize. I'm just gonna go back to the paper. And at Lewis, and we do a component, one of these papers from 2019. There's kind of almost a decision aspect to think about how you would whittle down to what species you may want to consider. But again, it's going to come down to your local kind of desires and aspects, but it can at least provide constraints around it.
Okay. Thank you. Laura is asking, do you use the SSO feature in the model to help identify trees to plant? Or if not, how do you select tree species for natural restoration projects?
Yeah, so the SSO one, so that's great. You're kind of already into the aspect. That was kind of initial an attempt to like get a list of species that kind of fill some of the buckets, right? In terms of their abundance and their potential changes in habitat and their life history characteristics. So it's a good place to start. I will say it's also important not to just exclude, other trees out of there, right? That's kind of our first cut, right? So I wouldn't just go to that column, right? But it is a really great place to like get a sense for what is maybe the diversity of trees that may have those characteristics that might be able to do. I mean, I wouldn't discount some of the other lower categories that are present there. So I'd use it as not as a kind of strict decision tree, but as a guideline, maybe and that's kind of informed by like based on those data. It's not incorporating, other information. Like if I plant this one here in terms of regeneration, what are my kind of desired conditions that I'm looking for, right? And if we go to that agroforestry kind of restoration side, is it a water component or is it another aspect? And that'd be a whole set of different decisions to make, obviously, as you know. So that's kind of how we typically think about using that column.
Okay. All right. With the understanding that tree species capture and store carbon at different rates, do you have a projection on if more or less carbon will be sequestered and stored over the next 80 to 100 years in light of these species shifts in our region?
Yeah, that's a great question. And recently there was a training where I presented on the Atlas to a forest carbon group, and I was really excited to hear about those considerations. So we don't necessarily at this time provide kind of those projections, and the way in which I've seen our work kind of be adapted to the carbon kind of dimension is just thinking about the abundance metrics, right? Thinking about those changes. But as we know, the way in which forests age and growth kind of are really important into those. So I would say like where the Atlas provides information is at that kind of species level. We have not kind of really dived in and dove into the carbon aspect, but there's certainly a lot of interest in places where we've been talking about doing that, but we don't have maps of that at this point. So I think it's definitely right on the area where people are asking that same question, and I guess we need to figure it out. So
Yeah. Susan is asking if you could repeat the name of the book shown on the third from the last slide.
Book third from the last. Oh, the Forest Guide for Forest Managing. And
Which
Matt
I
was
can-
on there. That one, and Marnie has it too.
Yeah,
That one?
I'll
Yeah.
pop the link.
Yeah,
up
so
for-
OBCI website.
It's on the
Matt,
Woodland
I know you're
Stewards.
on. If you want to do that too, Matt. You can
Yeah.
probably bookmark somewhere on your computer.
It's on
That's just
the
about-
Woodland Stewards website.
It's also on, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a great one. Okay. Okay, so there's a kind of a thought from an anonymous. They did say they missed part of the talk, but they have a question on if we are over analyzing the wrong thing. When glaciers melted, that was a much larger climate shift than anything currently projected. Forests adjusted with no help from us. At that time, there were no limitations to forest migration. Talking about how we've kind of made a mess of things by blocking migration. Should we look into making it more possible to migrate? Things are always changing. They never stay the same.
Yeah.
Those are kind of
Yeah. I mean,
some
yeah. So
comments.
I'll definitely. I mean, in terms of some general comments on that, I mean, I think
Yeah.
just to offer a few kind of ways in which we think about it. I mean, I think this idea that, in our approach, many ways of thinking about, trees, right, have historically, right, moved, right? We know that, and that's a really important feature of it. And that's kind of why we often think about this at the individual kind of species level. And that model of colonization uses historical migration rates as a kind of a core starting place to think about those aspects, but then incorporates land use change, right? Amount of forest to think about barriers to migration. So that gives us a picture of that. But then also like thinking about the community assemblages is really important, right? Yes, the trees have a potential to will respond independently to environmental stress, right? I mean, that's kind of they figure out solutions, right? Whether you're a gymnosperm, right? You deal with water differently than an angiosperm, right? And they have different tubes and plumbing, right? And so that's a really important aspect of the drought. So species do respond differently, but also that important way in which the forest community does facilitate resilience, I think is really important. And so that aspect of looking at both individual trees as well as a community perspective, novel and disappearing communities, is another important signal of that disequilibrium and disruption. So, I think there's a lot of really important information that we can learn, right, about forests and forest change, and hopefully can provide tools that we can, maintain those important forest functions going forward.
Right. Jay says that he learned a lot from Forests in Peril by Hazel Delcourt. And is asking, is this still considered a useful overview? And if so, I recommend it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, thinking about those contexts in which we think about forest and forest change, right? I mean, it's important, right? Thinking about those trajectories of change. So yeah, I think it's important. Yeah, I think it's important to read broadly and to think about those implications.
Right. Laura commented, "I'm willing to help with these efforts with updating." So you have a volunteer for some help.
We'll take her up on that.
If you'd like it. Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
All right. And Kurt's asking, what species are the best and most resilient for urban forests, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can find it right now, but there's been some interesting paper, a couple interesting papers. I think Leslie Brandt was on some of them. I know that. But just thinking of authors, who initially kind of took the tree atlas information, but also incorporated some additional urban specific life history characteristics, which I thought was a really neat extension, right? Because many of the life history characteristics we're thinking about are more kind of in our kind of natural forest components, but like evaluating those in addition to the atlas information is really important piece to do, right? And that is and then it's going to depend so much on which urban area you are in. So we have been doing some analysis on the 170 kind of urban centers across the Eastern US, looking at this kind of aspect of communities, forest communities, individual tree components. And one really striking, interesting component to think about is, there's two different ways in which that is influenced. It's the amount of forest kind of within the city itself, but it's also kind of thinking about what is that kind of community and tree species how diverse is that tree species composition, and so I mean it does vary a lot, and even across cities that are relatively close to each other, they have some pretty different projected changes in responses. So it really depends on what urban area you're talking about, and then what sort of stressors they would likely be playing, but then thinking about the unique planting considerations you have within urban settings. And that's what a lot of the other urban folks have extended on, which is really great to see, right? We don't pretend to understand all the intricacies that are going on within those, but to see it being applied is a good example. But I can get a copy of that paper and post it.
Right. And then he kind of had another question as well. Do you see any problems with using Western red cedar as a replacement for hemlocks as climate change is changing the success of hemlocks?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think, it's really interesting to think about, I mentioned the adaptive silviculture for climate change study. In Ohio, we aren't necessarily planting stuff from that far outside its range, but some of the other sites are kind of, testing and looking at these other tree species, so like the original cutfoot one using, ponderosa pine, right? Again, it's grew the most, right? But it also had the most mortality in those early years. So it's really interesting. And I think as we learn more about these aspects, it really is really informative and enlightening, right? Many trees can grow where you plant them. But what is their viability? And then thinking about, a functional change of, hemlock or cedar, and how do those aspects come into play. So I'm really excited to see some of these studies that will maybe give a little better answer, because, of those potential.
Okay. Cassie's asking, can you walk through a comparison of decline for ash or silver maple?
Sure. Like in terms of decline, in terms of, and yeah, this in terms of thinking about like changes in habitat decline, or thinking about like, ash is the classic example. Like some areas, right, it may have projected not to lose that much habitat, but that's where obviously we know, right, EAB kind of takes care of that projection. So like of thinking about the temporal sequence is really important to it, and acknowledging what is in and what is not in a model, right, to project this habitat change. So ash is a kind of a great example of using that adaptability kind of information to inform like its capability to cope, right? It's not going to be very capable, especially in areas, right, where we have a bit potential for EAB, or it already is. Silver maple, likewise, it's a tree, right? If you think about its distribution, right, it has a little bit more of a patchily distributed and associated with riparian type areas, so it's a little bit harder to model. So in many cases, what we see is it's projected to be present within these areas, but maybe in some places at lower abundance because of that important way in which precipitation would kind of influence its distribution. So again, it's much more patchy. That has to do with its kind of contemporary distribution on the landscape. But I'm happy offline, I can go into more detail. There's a question.
All right, Matthew's asking, the geological record indicates the climate has always changed and been in a state of flux. Are there any renderings or models that reflect species migration over the last 1,000 years?
Yeah, there's definitely been attempts, and I'm trying to find it. So there's some, kind of linking up kind of historic kind of records, pollen records and change, right, is a really important aspect. A couple years ago, there was a, it's not to be confusing, right? There's a forest atlas, right? That kind of a more broad kind of survey of forest conditions. And in there's a chapter called Forests on the Move. And I know we kind of developed a figure that in there that at least looked at a species, right, and those potential changes, kind of overlaying that sequence of change through time. Because I think it's really important to think about historical limits for tree species, and how fast they were able to respond to, like the question earlier, retreat of the glaciers, but also, right, the way in which refugia played a really important role in that, way in which animal dispersal played a really important role in that. There's lots of pieces that are in play, and so that's why kind of maintaining these healthy kind of productive forests, I think, is in diverse forests is quite important, right? Because the way in which change occurs, right, is very much dynamic and influenced by these other factors. And so so that was one example. I know we kind of tried to align those sequences over time, but I think it's also important, like in many cases too, to like I mentioned before, that migration shift model uses like those historic kind of migration rates as a way to estimate that. And in doing that work, attesting a lot of different ways in which trees can disperse. And we'll get into the details of the modeling there, but like you think about how far the darts can be thrown varies by species, right? And try really to incorporate a lot of that based on the historic evidence we have from pollen and other records.
Thank you. Catherine says, good information, thank you. Do you know if there are other efforts like this for insects or forest floor plants?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are certainly, always kind of lots of other great resources, and we'll say like within this kind of dimension of thinking about responses, I will. I mean, I'm kind of going a little off topic, but I'll come back to the topic, right? Like using multiple kind of approaches is really important. A lot of the chances where we've had to interact with people that have very different modeling philosophies of change, like there's Landis model is a great example, but like comparing the results is really enlightening, like where they agree, but also where they disagree. It allows us to learn a lot about what we don't know. So just to acknowledge that there's lots of different ways to look at it, and we should look at these different ways. For insects, I mean, I do know there are underways. There are kind of activities underway to address that, especially on the forest pest side in terms of insects, right? And thinking about how those interact with changing distributions for both pests, for insects and trees. But then on the other insect aspects, there's some really neat interest developments going on with the I think it's the one of the Fish and Wildlife Service climate research centers, really looking at that intersection between like pollinators and change and life history traits, which I think is a really cool tool, and hopefully they'll kind of have that out relatively soon, right? Trying really to understand those important kind of foundational species related to insects and their important role that insects play. So that I know that's underway. And understory plants, I mean, that is a great one. I would love to see that develop further. There are some attempts that have attempted that do that, but kind of bringing in the way in which you can have enough data, right? Trees are easy relatively. We have this great resource in forest inventory analysis, right? It gets a little harder to get the data to do something like we do, but there's lots of other tools out there to model, rare plants or plants that are not as captured in terms of maybe presence, absence instead of abundance. So I do know that there's a couple of examples in papers where people have looked at understory plants, which I think is a really important aspect to do. And I do think some of those other models like Landis and other places that are more simulation models, have the capability of thinking about biomass change and that has implication for some of those plants as well. So yeah, not a great answer. There are things out there, but it's great to see that people are really pushing the envelope to try to really build a more robust kind of perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. James is asking, do you plan to eventually link this model to planning for future changes to forest and forest management approaches?
Yeah, yeah, some of it depends. I mean, it's just, yes, we'd love to see it kind of utilized as a tool, right? And I think we are seeing that, right? Whether we're thinking about climate scorecards within national forests and other aspects that are just, using the forest action plan, having climate change sections, vision forestry, division of wildlife, these ways in which we can begin to, managing the climate change in mind isn't a totally new way of managing, our forests, but it's important to incorporate this understanding, right, that these changes are occurring and will have implications going forward. So it is really neat to see, and I really value the opportunity to be in some of the vulnerability assessments or talking to the forest managers. I mean, and in many cases they they get it, right? We're managing for 70, 80 years out, and this is right not foreign, right? When we think about managing forests, and so it fits in with that, and it's not a radical change in the ways in which we manage, but this perspective of conditions shifting is important, piece to it. I think there's lots of great examples where that's starting to happen, right? Especially around system migration and thinking about not only just the plant but species to promote, right, that are already in.
And kind of related, regarding specific forest management practices, like for timber logging operations, James is also asking, it seems like maybe lower intensity methods should be examined, question mark, or we just don't know that yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the system, right? And what is trying to be promoted. Like, so the ask site is an interesting, is a good example, right? Want to maintain the oak component, right? Managing that light aspect is really important. Thinking about expanding, gap type methods, right? Is certainly something we should test, right? As opposed to maybe the way in which we would think about it on other, shelter woods. And I think that's where that art and science and silviculture comes into play of what is, how are we trying to manage it? So in some cases that's lowering density if we're thinking about a place that is a drought stress and other aspects in forest communities, right? Because we kind of see evidence of how that kind of comes into play within forests when they're under stress and higher densities. And so it really comes down to like, what are the near objective with an eye towards the long-term realities of a shifting kind of condition. So yeah, it's really going to be highly dependent on the system that is going to promote the forest that is kind of desired.
Got it. There's a question about who is coming out with the agroforestry handbook.
Yeah, so that is so that would be Forest Service, the agroforestry group. So Ann Marsh is the one leading that kind of that aspect.
Okay.
Yeah, just kind of highlighted that. So something we just recently did the appendix for that, and it was really great to see they were making some really great progress on that.
Right. Kurt is asking, saying that's interesting that pawpaw was one of the last of the true tropical remnant tree species. Should it be on the vulnerable list as our climate is changing, as we get warmer?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I mean, I mean, I think it's it's so interesting to think about like phylogenetic diversity of plants that we kind of have, and pawpaw really presents a unique piece. And I don't know off the top of my head like everywhere what the projections are for a species like pawpaw. I can't keep those in my head. And so I actually can't speak to what the overall projections, but maybe you already have, and it's one's declining. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly ways in which we can. I think it's important, right, to try to maintain habitats for those species.
Yeah, that's an interesting one to think about, because you're like naturally like, oh well, it's warming, it should do better. It's a tropical, but I wonder if it has to do with timing and pollination and whatever pollinates it, and so many different things go into these. So yeah, cool.
Yep.
Interesting to think about. Okay, Sue is saying she said she just missed a few of your talks, and she'll make sure to catch a few minutes in the beginning, and we'll catch up later. But she's asking about does the 600-year success of the Logan oak speak well for its progeny going into the future?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting piece to it, right? When we think about, and I think it goes back to like, what we are looking at here, right? In many cases, what we are kind of evaluating, looking at here are those species that are representing more in that larger, older age class, right? And so I would say like the inference that these are making are more towards those that are established, right? We're not addressing regeneration, right? Because there's a whole other kind of constraints that, kind of limit trees on that regeneration side of things. And so, yeah, I don't know if I can really comment. I might have to ask for a little help from Marnie and Kathy. I'm thinking about that, but I do think that idea of, maintaining, conserving, understanding genetic diversity is really important. One of the projects that we've had a fortunate to work on, it's in the elm system, here with the Delaware lab folks. I mean, looking at phenology difference between these different genotypes of elm. I mean, they do, right, respond differently to like their flowering and leaf out, right? And that really, has certainly a strong environmental control, but there's an underlying genetic piece. And so these long-lived species, right, and these long-lived individuals, right, that's important that we understand and capture that important part of the genetic diversity, not just in terms of the climate change aspect, but just in terms of maintaining that blueprint.
Matthew has a comment. It will be interesting to see how species migration in disturbed forest ecosystems reacts to invasive species over time.
Yeah, it really will be. I mean, yeah, and like understanding the interactions and the abilities for species to disperse is really important, you know. And I'm just referencing like previous, you know, student here, Jay Wright, who's now at Toledo Parks. I mean, his work with looking at chestnuts and oak kind of dispersal by blue jays is, I mean, that was one of the reasons why when he wanted to ask that question is, right, you have these different ways in which species are able to move, and sort of think like, you know, blue jay dispersals, right? In some cases, fragmented landscape, they may move farther, right? Because they're kind of hopping between areas, whereas, you know, in cases planting them in areas non-randomly, right, not out in the open, right, is an important part, right? Things like oaks in terms of light. So I think there's a lot of really important aspects that, you know, the way in which migration for trees is facilitated within the context of our, you know, land use change is a really important area to keep understanding, but it's also an important area to think about connectivity of forest, right? Thinking about the flow for trees to be able to respond and move, right? I think that those are all important things we think about in like our conservation and planning kind of mindset.
I think one of the things that I've been getting lots of questions on, Steve, is, you know, initially when we talked about sugar maple was going to disappear, which panicked a lot of folks. But I think now that the second concern with sugar maple, not so much from the climate aspect, is losing beech because of beech leaf disease. So what does that do to that sugar maple component that's used to coexisting with a beech component that may not be there to coexist with? And that seems to be one that's starting to catch people's attention and asking questions. And it's kind of like,
yeah,
I don't
it's
know.
really hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's, I mean, that's an important part of it, right? You know, is that, and that's kind of part of the motivation why we're not only just looking at individual species now, we're thinking about those community characteristics of the broader aspect to try to identify this. And that's kind of a way in which thinking about disappearing forest and novel forest kind of conditions, because, you know, beech makes such an important part of that in terms of regulating the moisture and light environment, right, is really important, right? And so thinking about it from those two sides of the coin is really important. And so that's part of, you know, why we're trying to understand it from that realm, because we know it's not just, you know, what happens to the species is what's going to happen, right? It really does depend on the community. Right?
Yeah, the outside factors that you can't control.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, none of us plan for beech leaf disease.
Nope.
Yeah.
So, okay.
We did have one more question come in. So Kristen's asking, on the big grid of current and potential habitat, capability and migration of trees, under range, there is a measure of high and low importance. What does that importance mean? And she's asking, is that importance to animals dependent on it, or people, or something else?
Trying to remember.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, which, it might have been that one.
We have range, right? I'm trying to think of which one it is.
And feel free, Kristen, to put it in the chat or in the Q&A if we're not on the right track here.
Importance.
Is that the
range? There's a measure of high and low importance under range. So yeah, maybe the one right next door.
the MR or the adapt?
He said under range, the third.
I mean, range. I mean, range is basically, I mean, that is just trying to capture like how widely distributed and how dense it is, right? You know, kind of across its range, right? And so the idea is, you know, is it a species that is, you know, really widely distributed, maybe it occurs at a lower density, or is it a species that may be relatively restricted in its range but has a higher density where it is? It's essentially meant to just capture that general pattern. I think you can infer probably maybe more, you know, from in the specific area you're in, thinking about the percentage of the cells that are occupied and the importance value. So importance value is a metric, and maybe that's for part of it too, right? It's it's essentially the basal area and the number of stems. So it's kind of a measure of, and it's relative to the other trees there. So that's kind of like, you can think about that measure of abundance. So thinking about the cells, percentage of the cells, right, that are kind of the species occupies, and then thinking about the importance value, right? That kind of gives you the picture of how abundant and widely spread it is. And the range one is just trying to capture, in some cases, like, what is its general pattern?
General pattern, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, hopefully that answers your question,
So
Kristen.
Steve, if you look at that, what's WDH versus WDL?
Yeah.
That wide distribution.
Wide distribution, high range.
And then,
Okay.
right, yeah, and
That's what I was figuring, but I wanted to.
It is. Yep. No,
make
that's good.
sure.
So yeah, so
okay.
That's some definitions. I should just go to the range. So yeah, wide versus narrow, dense versus sparse,
Narrow,
high versus
okay.
low. Yep. So that's it.
Okay.
That's why the table's there.
That's why it's there.
Great question.
Okay.
Okay.
And then there was a request for slides from your talk, and Steve, it's whatever you want to do. If you want to send them to me, I can email them to folks, or we can post them on our website. Whatever you're comfortable with. Just like
either.
a PDF of the slides, and yep, I'll get them posted for folks when we post the recording. But I think we've got through all of the questions, so I'm going to stop recording. Thank you so much, Steve. This was wonderful. And Kathy will pop up the continuing education link.